All right, in this video, we're going to focus on how to evaluate the market potential for a business idea. So we're now going to get into some of the evaluative process in which we're taking a look at different ideas that we've generated that have the potential to earn us some type of revenue and be commercially viable. And we know that ideas may have differing or varying degrees of potential. And so we want a way to evaluate the various ideas we have in a quick but very systematic way so that we can determine out of all the ideas that we have, which one has the potential to be more viable. So for starters, we're going to talk through this concept called a total addressable market. Now, when we're thinking about a market, when we talk about the term of a market, all we're referring to is a collection of buyers and sellers. And so by definition, markets are ultimately transaction-based. And so you have a buyer, someone that has ownership of some kind of asset, most commonly money. And then you have a seller, someone who has access to a good or service, and the two parties agree to facilitate an exchange. That's kind of what is the underpinning of market-based economies, much like we have here in the US, is you have transactions that take place between buyers and sellers. So ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to evaluate the market. We're trying to evaluate the degree to which there are buyers for our potential business idea, so ultimately we can have a viable business. So in order for us to estimate this market, there's a couple of things that we can do to kind of determine whether or not it is viable. So the first concept that we're going to talk about is what we call a total addressable market, commonly referred to simply as TAM, or total addressable market. Now, the total addressable market is essentially the larger market to which any particular buyers for a product or service reside. So this is the entire market. This is essentially if you were to sell a product to every single person that could possibly obtain it. This is what we call the total addressable market. Now, what we know is that businesses never really sell to the entire total addressable market because we have competition and there are varying needs within that larger market. And so you have a lot of different competitors and a lot of different solutions. So we can't necessarily acquire everything, but it's still nice to understand what the total addressable market would be. So as an example, let's say that I'm going to open a coffee shop and I'm trying to figure out what my total addressable market would be. Well, you could argue that by opening up a coffee shop, your total addressable market is the number of coffee drinkers. Now, in a particular area, this can be a very high percentage. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to acquire all of the people within this larger market. This simply means that this is kind of the ceiling for this particular business idea, as the number of coffee drinkers would represent our total addressable market. Likewise, if we were producing smartphones, our total addressable market would be everyone that had a smartphone, which is a lot of people. So we know that businesses, though, aren't necessarily going to sell to this wide a range of people. Now, we don't want to base our financials on this number because this is very unrealistic, right? This is a very optimistic thing, projecting that all of these people are going to buy our product. And we want to be very conservative, especially when we're trying to kind of estimate what our startup costs would be, but also estimate revenue for cash flow purposes. We don't want to paint this overly rosy picture and then realize when it does not come to fruition, now we've overextended ourselves and we have a number of different problems. So it's nice to know the total addressable market, but this is not one that we really want to base a lot of our financials off of because it tends to be very unrealistic as far as our ability to acquire those customers. Now, within the total addressable market, we also have a few different markets as well. So the first one here is what we call the serviceable addressable market. So I'm going to draw kind of a market, a little circle within this larger circle, and this is going to represent the serviceable addressable market, which I'll abbreviate as SAM. Now, this is essentially the market that we can reach. This is what we call reachable. So where the total addressable market refers to everyone that has a potential that could be potentially a buyer, it doesn't necessarily kind of incorporate our ability to serve that particular market. So the serviceable addressable market is all about the number of people that are reachable. So in our example, we're talking about a coffee shop. So we're not just dealing with the number of coffee drinkers, but we're also dealing with number of coffee drinkers that maybe reside within a specific area. Because we know that every single business that has a physical location has what we call a serviceable area. And this is a very important thing to think about if you are opening up a brick and mortar location where you're expecting customers to come to you. Now, a serviceable area is essentially how far customers are willing to go to get to you. Now, this depends largely on the type of products that you sell. So if you operate a very broad or kind of general business where you sell sandwiches, for example, the serviceable area would be very narrow for that type of business because people aren't willing to drive as far to you because there are a lot of competitors. Contrary to that, you have specialty type businesses where they're very niche. There's not a lot of them in an area, and so the serviceable area tends to be a lot wider. So one of the things that we want to think about within this serviceable area market is ultimately what's the size or how far are people willing to go to get to me? What is my serviceable area? This is going to be helpful when we get to the point to where we're actually trying to quantify the number of customers. That's directly tied to the number of people that reside within our physical location. So we want to know what's our serviceable addressable market? How many people can we actually serve for a physical business like a coffee shop or a retailer? This is usually to deal with proximity, right? The number of people within a given area. And notice that will be a smaller subset of our total addressable market. Now, one of the questions that you might be answering or might be asking yourself is, well, what if I have an online business? Because technically, if I have an online business, then I can sell products to anywhere. So I'm not necessarily constricted by this same kind of geographic limitations, much like a physical brick and mortar business. And yes and no, right? Simply because we can distribute everywhere does not mean our customer is everywhere. That just means that our distribution is wider than a brick and mortar business, much like a coffee shop or a physical retailer. But that does not mean that our customer is everywhere. Instead, what we will want to think about to try to figure out our serviceable area market is we might want to do some research into keywords. There are a lot of really good tools online that you can utilize as a way to figure out how many times people are searching for specific keywords that might relate to my business idea. One of the tools that I've used in the past is the Google Keyword Planner tool. And this is a tool that you can use if you have a Google Ads account, which is free to obtain. And so you register for a Google Ads account. You certainly don't have to run ads unless you really want to. But under the kind of planning function there, you can find the Keyword Planner tool. And it's actually pretty intuitive. You simply enter some keywords in, and then Google will tell you how many times people have searched for those words, and then you can fine tune it and start looking in specific geographic areas. So if you're an online business, ultimately your customer base isn't dependent upon your geography, but is ultimately a subset of how many people are actually looking for your specific keywords. So that's one thing that's helpful. That could represent maybe your serviceable area market, people that are actually searching for you. Now, Google's Keyword Planner tool isn't the only tool. You can find a number of different ones, but a lot of them are paid for services, so just be careful of that. Now, the next area or the next market, if you will, within this kind of diagram is what we call the share of market. Now, this is the smallest piece within this total addressable market. And so we call this the share of market, commonly abbreviated as SOM, but it's share of market. And this represents the actual percentage of the market that we can obtain. So realistically, what percentage of maybe it's internet traffic that is searching for a particular keyword do you think that we can possibly attract? what percentage of people that reside within our serviceable area that are coffee drinkers do you think we can get to come into our coffee shop? And so notice that the market is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So where in a specific area, you might say that, well, the total addressable market, the number of coffee drinkers within an area, let's say hypothetically represents 500,000 people. We might say, well, those that residing within our serviceable addressable market, which we say, if just hypothetically, let's say is a smaller subset of that, but we believe that people would drive upwards of 3 miles to get to us, because once you get outside of that, there are other coffee shops. And so we're expecting someone to drive by a competitor to come to us. While that may happen, we don't want to bank on the fact that everyone is going to do that. So we might say, well, within our smaller market, we actually have about 60,000 people that reside within our serviceable addressable market. This is who is willing to drive to us. And then a percentage of that we might say is like, well, realistically, we would think that we can probably acquire maybe 10% of those customers, which we would then say we can acquire potentially 6,000 people. Now, that doesn't mean that 6,000 people are, of course, coming into our coffee shop every single day. We would certainly have regulars, but that just means that we believe that we can acquire 10% of the market. Now, that's a very quick and very kind of dirty calculation. I will show you how to do a little bit more thorough calculations, but what's helpful to kind of think through is these 3 individual markets, because when if we're not careful, oftentimes we tend to focus on, well, what's the market, what's the total addressable market. That's oftentimes the statistics that we rely upon when we're doing our projections. And while that does kind of fully kind of convey the opportunity, when we are really evaluating the business idea, we really want to think about, well, what is the customer group that I can serve? Because the reality is I can't manufacture enough products to appeal to everyone. There are logistical issues there, there are sourcing issues there, there are labor issues there, and then ultimately there are competitors in the market, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that there are others that we're going to need to compete with. And when we enter a market, we really oftentimes don't create new customers, right? Generally, we're kind of taking from existing customers. So as an example, let's say the serviceable area market, there's 60,000 people, but there are 2 coffee shops already in that area. Well, in theory, you could say, well, that means that, we have 60,000 people, so every coffee shop currently is getting 30,000, right? 60,000 divided by the 2 existing coffee shops. So if I go into this market, then I'm also going to get 30,000 people. But the reality is when we enter a market that's established, we're not necessarily adding new customers, right? Me opening up a coffee shop doesn't, in fact, educate people about this new thing called coffee. Instead, what happens is I take that existing population, and now instead of dividing it by 2 competitors, now I divide it by 3. And so you can argue that there are now 20,000 customers in the market. So ultimately, we have to be aware of what the competition is like as well. We simply can't go into a market and there's this giant kind of bubble that protects us and insulates us from what's happening. But the reality is that we are going to compete. And in a market-based economy that relies a lot on competition to the benefit of consumers, those are dynamics that we have to be aware of. So as we kind of close this video, the one thing that I want to kind of come back to is it's important to think about your market in these 3 areas. The first thing is looking at what is the total market, the total number of people that have a potential need for the solution that you're providing, and then ultimately within that, what's your serviceable addressable market? What is the number of people that you can realistically reach, whether that's through your physical channels, whether that's through your online distribution, and then ultimately, what is the share of the market that you can acquire? How many competitors are in this space? What is their relative size, and what potential share of that market can you acquire? It's not going to be an exact science. So if you're the type of person that really wants like a hard number, it's going to be very difficult because there's a lot of variables. But ultimately, thinking through these three components helps us get at least in the ballpark, right? We're not going to get 100% accurate, but the goal is just to get kind of close. And if we can get close, then that means that at least the projections and the assumptions and the decisions that we're making are at least a little bit more sound than if we did not have access to that information.